The myth of Mercy Brown is one of the most famous and chilling vampire legends to emerge from 19th century America. Set against the backdrop of rural New England, this story intertwines folklore, fear, and the real-life tragedy of a young woman's untimely death, and it has captivated both historians and paranormal enthusiasts for over a century. Mercy Brown was born in 1871 in Exeter, Rhode Island, to a family that would soon become known not for their wealth or status, but for their connection to a mysterious and terrifying event. Her father, George Brown, had already lost his wife and 2 children to a strange illness that seemed to sweep through the family in waves. The illness, later believed to be tuberculosis, was highly contagious and was often called consumption because of the way it slowly drained the life from its victims. It was during this outbreak that Mercy herself fell ill. Mercy's health deteriorated rapidly, and in January 1892, she died from the disease. Her passing was seen as just another tragic loss in a community already burdened by grief. However, the myth begins to take root when her brother, Edwin, also succumbed to the same illness shortly after Mercy's death. The town, already gripped by fear and superstition, began to suspect that something more sinister was at work. At the time, tuberculosis was a disease that was poorly understood, and many people believed that it could be caused or worsened by supernatural forces. In particular, the people of Exeter feared that the deceased were returning from the grave as vampires, feeding off the living and causing their illness. This belief in the undead was common in rural New England, and the fear of vampirism had been perpetuated by earlier folklore and reports of vampire sightings in the region. As Edwin's condition worsened, his doctors and family grew increasingly desperate. They believed that the only way to stop the disease from spreading was to dig up the bodies of the deceased and perform rituals to ensure they would not return as vampires. In March of 1892, Mercy's body, along with those of her mother and sister, was exhumed in a bizarre attempt to rid the town of its curse. What they found when they opened Mercy's grave would fuel the vampire legend for generations. Mercy's body was reportedly in an unusually well-preserved state for someone who had been dead for several months. Her skin was described as ruddy and pinkish, and her hair and nails were said to have grown longer. Most damning of all, they found that her heart was still intact. To the superstitious townspeople, this was clear evidence that she had been feeding on her brother's life force, and that she had returned from the grave as a vampire. The solution, as per local custom, was to remove the heart, burn it, and mix the ashes with water, which was then given to Edwin to drink in the hopes of curing him. Unfortunately, Edwin died shortly after, and the myth of Mercy Brown, the vampire, became a permanent part of local lore. In the years that followed, Mercy's story was turned into a tale of supernatural horror. The idea that a young woman's body could have risen from the grave to drain the life from her loved ones became a story that captured the imagination of both the public and the press. Newspapers reported on the exhumation, spreading the legend far beyond Rhode Island, and Mercy became a symbol of vampire folklore in America. Yet, the story of Mercy Brown is also deeply tragic. It reflects the fear and ignorance surrounding disease during a time when tuberculosis claimed thousands of lives and when people were desperate for explanations. The exhumation and subsequent rituals were rooted in superstition, and they resulted in the desecration of a young woman's grave, turning her memory into one of horror rather than remembrance. Mercy Brown was never given the dignity of being remembered as the victim of a deadly illness, but instead was immortalized as a figure of supernatural fear. Today, the myth of Mercy Brown lives on. Her story has inspired books, films, and documentaries, and her name is often invoked in discussions of vampire legends and New England folklore. In 1990, a plaque was erected at her grave site, acknowledging the tragic events and bringing a degree of respect to her memory. The myth of Mercy Brown endures because it is not just a tale of vampirism. It is a story about fear, disease, and the lengths to which people will go when they are confronted with the unknown. It is a reminder of a time when death, illness, and the supernatural were deeply intertwined, and when a community's desperate need for answers could lead to disturbing actions that would haunt history forever.